Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, ladies and gents. May peace and God's mercy and blessings be upon you all. Thank you very much for attending this evening for what is the last event of Experience Islamic 2011. My name is Sufyan Yunus. I am your host for this evening, and I shall be leading you through question time, Islam in Britain today and tomorrow. We are very fortunate to have three esteemed panelists this evening. Starting from my far right, we have Myriam Francois-Cerrah, who was born in London of French and Irish heritage. She completed her BA in Social and Political Sciences from Cambridge Newnham College in 2003, after which she worked for a year at MEND, a Palestinian NGO in Jerusalem, where she received training in active non-violence and conflict resolution techniques. She has an MA in Arab Studies. She has an MA in Arab Studies, specializing in Middle Eastern politics from Georgetown University, and has collaborated on with numerous media outlets in the production of documentaries, articles, and current affairs comments. She is currently undertaking a doctorate of philosophy at Oxford University, focusing on Islamic movements in Morocco, and is a researcher with the European Muslim Research Centre. Next, we have Mr. Dilwar Hussein, who is head of the Policy Research Centre based at the Islamic Foundation in Leicestershire. He is a specialist advisor to the House of Commons inquiry into the Prevent strategy in 2010, a member of the Archbishop's Commission on Urban Life and Faith in 2006, and co-chair of the Aleph UK 2005 group on Muslim-Jewish relations. His research interests are social policy, Muslim identity, and Islam in the modern world, on which he has written numerous journals and books. Also, he is on the steering group of the Contextualizing Islam in Britain project at Cambridge University. He is married with 4 children and lives in Leicester. And last but not least, we have Nabil Ahmed, President of the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, FOSIS, an organisation established in 1963, striving to serve and represent 100,000 Muslim students studying UK and Ireland. He studied at the University of Manchester, and whilst he was at university, had been involved with the NUS steering committee, as well as since then advising successive ministers for higher education, as well as the Business Innovation and Skills Department of the government. He's personally involved with the United Nations Alliance. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. Before I lay out the procedure for tonight's discussion, we'd like to begin with a traditional Muslim opening to an event with a Quran recitation. So I'd like to call upon Qasim.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذوي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وأقام الصلاة وآتى الزكاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوه والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البأس أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون صدق الله العظيم.
I'd like to point you to the handouts where the translation of the just recited verse is, and to actually recite the translation. It's from the second chapter of the Quran, Surah Baqarah, or the Haifa. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. It is not righteousness that you turn your faces towards east or west, but it is righteousness to believe in God in the last day, and the angels, and the book, and the messengers, to spend of your substance out of love for Him, for your kin, for orphans, for the needy, for the wayfarer, for those who ask, and for the ransom of slaves, to be steadfast in prayer and practice regular charity, to fulfill the contracts which ye have made, and to be firm and patient in pain or suffering and adversity, and throughout all periods of panic. Such are the people of truth, the God-conscious. without further ado, let's begin with our discussion. Tonight we have 4 broad-based topics that we will be discussing in equal segments. Each topic will approximately have about 15 minutes, and at the end we'll have an open Q&A session where we'll pick up topics that we perhaps had to rush away from because of time limits. If at any time you have a question, a comment, or something to contribute to the discussion, please raise your hand and I'll try and include you. Obviously we have 3 panellists and a very short space of time to do this, so don't be offended if I don't choose you. And the 15 minutes at the end should provide a buffer where we can bring up topics that were neglected. Please remember to note down any questions that you may have, and then we can come back to them at the end. I think that's about it. Without any further ado, let's begin. So our first topic of this evening is the role of religion in society. We see in the headlines and we watch in the news division, sectarianism, intolerance, intransigency. Is religion really relevant for society today? Is religion relevant in secular Britain? Mr. Dilwar Hussein, what are your thoughts?
Well, evidently religion is relevant, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it so much. Perhaps you could even argue the opposite, that we have a preoccupation with religion right now. And in many ways, there was a thesis a few years ago, some decades ago, that with the development of societies, through secularization processes, religion would just disappear and become very marginal and nobody would really talk about it anymore. I suppose in some ways the presence of Islam has disproved that theory, and people like Peter Berger, who, for example, once upon a time were talking about religion disappearing, are now talking about the reaffirmation of religion. Having said that, I do think we have to be careful, and I think also we have to think about the public space in societies which are mixed, which are multicultural, which are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and we have to think in a very sober and serious way about how we manage the public space where so many different religions, values, ideas come together, and how we negotiate that public space. So for me, I think as a bottom line, secularism, if we can differentiate between procedure and ideology, and this is what the Archbishop of Canterbury calls procedural secularism and programmatic secularism, if we can differentiate between these two things, then some types of secularism, i.e. maintaining a neutral public space, or the state not being involved directly in endorsing one or another religion, I think that is a good thing. Where we have mixed societies, as you could argue all societies are now in an age of globalization, it would appear to me that secularism is a good thing and a good way for us to manage societies that are very mixed.
Do you not feel that that's failing miserably currently when we see isolated groups, segregated communities?
Yeah, I mean, one could put that argument forward, but also mono-religious societies are failing, I think, in an even worse way. So where you have religion completely in bed with the state, as you have in some countries in the Middle East, we can see what's happening there. So neither of those two extreme models seems to work. Neither the French model of trying to eradicate religion from public life, nor the model of the religion and the state being one, and there not being a sophisticated differentiation between the two. Neither of those seems to work. What's happening here in Britain, and we've just recently produced a book plug on this issue of secularism. What's happening here in Britain seems to be a reasonable happy medium. Now, of course, in all societies, we're going to have problems. We're going to have to negotiate our way through very difficult, challenging issues. It's not easy when many, many different people with very different backgrounds, cultures, ideas, beliefs are trying to negotiate a space together. That conversation is not always going to be easy. I would argue that here in Britain we do that much better than most other places.
Mr. Ahmed, do you see that translating on the scene, on the student scene? I mean, what good does Islam or a religion in general contribute to campus life?
Thank you for that. Beginning in the name of Allah, the Lord of Mercy, the Giver of Mercy. I think a useful starting point actually is to say that an event like this is testament to good things happening on the ground where people are coming to discuss and talk about religion. I guess the offset of that, and I was speaking to a scholar just a few days ago actually in Nottingham, and he remarked actually how he came over here actually to Cambridge last week, Sheikh Idris, and he mentioned how he went for the service in, I think, the church just behind us actually, in the afternoon, and he talked about how serene it was in there, how beautiful it was in there, and so on and so forth, and how beautiful the sermon that he heard as well. But the other thing that he remarked was that he was one of 2 people sat in the sermon at the time. I think we're facing a really interesting time, and this is reflected on campuses where I guess the offset of what a lot of the discussion that we're seeing in the media, a lot of what is playing to people's fears in regard to Islam, is also generating a lot of discussion on university campuses. But also, I've had a part-time job where I've worked in a warehouse, and there's a lot of people working there, and they come and ask me, and they say, Nabil, what is it about Islam and women? Why is it that Muslims are doing that to women? Why is it that Islam is so involved in all these terrorism issues as well? So it's generating a lot of debate. I think in that sense it's a very positive thing that we are seeing a lot of debate taking place. But
you say debate, but surely faith comes in with a very dogmatic, I believe this is my faith. Is that really healthy to discussion and debate? Is that what free speech and liberalism is about?
That's a deep question. Where I would start is, I think debate and discussion is a useful starting point. And I think just at that starting point as well is that people are starting to realise that Islam is a lot more than what they see on the media. I think people are also starting to realise, Muslims included, that Islam is a lot more than kind of ritualised aspects that we often see. It's more than just a prayer and the fasting and so on and so forth. Going back to actually the recitation that we heard at the start here actually as well, it talked about charitable works, it talked about the needy and the poor. Islam is a holistic way of life, and that sort of approach of understanding Islam is that actually deeply, I think a lot of people are relating to that, where Islam and religion is perhaps being transferred from the private space into the public space, to where something is a lot more than just perhaps a Sunday service or a sermon at one point in the week, but rather inspires people to do good things and do good works. So the discussion is good. I think, I guess as students, we're particularly lucky, we're particularly thoughtful to be able to come to these sorts of debates where I guess the rest of society isn't getting to do that as well.
I think at this point I would like to open up to the floor. Is there anyone with a question or comment to the panel? No, in which case we'll go over to Miss Francois-Cerrah. Is that French pronunciation correct?
Perfect. Good.
Fantastic.
A+, yeah.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, I mean, the way that I look at it is, Islam operates at all levels. That is, the individual in response to the collective, the material and the spiritual, and the social and the political. So really, faith has something to contribute at all of those levels. At the very personal level, it's a form of self-discipline. It's a way of regulating the self, and of course from there regulating society. So first and foremost, the message of Islam, and I think the recitation actually really showed that, is that the primary sort of orientation of revelation is purification of the self, self-control, self-discipline, so that we as individual units are better versions of ourselves.
So are you saying that religion is a very much personal thing and therefore should remain within the home as a personal sphere, and let's leave it from public?
Actually, I think what Islam says is you develop yourself on a personal level so that you can then go out as agents of change into the broader society in order to effect positive change more broadly. So then that's where we see purified individuals who, if you like, can put aside their personal interest in order to seek the betterment of society, working for the collective good, be that at the social or political level. The other thing, the role that I think that religion plays in society, and We've seen that this is true by the fact that there's a rise in religiosity globally. Now, obviously, religiosity is incredibly difficult to measure, if not impossible, but what we can see is a rise or a trend of rise towards greater interest in religion across all different religions, I might add. And in that vein, I wanted to quote a very short quote by an Islamic scholar called Hussein Nasr, who says, "The need to recover a vision of the centre becomes ever more urgent for Western man as the illusory world he has created around himself in order to forget the loss of the transcendent dimension on his life begins to reveal ever more fully its true character." And I think what he's pointing to there is again a role that religion plays in balancing the sort of deep materialism of a capitalist society in which all focus is on the outwardly, and remembering that actually there's much more to life than that.
Mr. Hussein, coming back to your first point, where do we go forward from here? At a time when we are at a crossroads, as you mentioned, how do we engage this secularist or increasingly secularist state with the contribution of faith?
Well, and let me say something that will also add to what I've already said and also answer your question. Just as I think there's a broad agreement that religion does have a social role, that religion does have something to say to society. The question, I think, where disagreements might come up and where some tension might come up in this conversation is how much of a role religion should play in society. Should it be something that is an individual's choice, and then people take inspiration from that religion, you create social movements and civic movements and so on that act in the name of religion? For example, you have the Catholic Church, you might have Muslim communities, you have the Anglican Communion and so on. Or should you, and some Muslims would say that in a Muslim society, or even here in the West, you should actually govern and rule in the name of Islam. And that is where I'm saying we may have got that wrong. For those people who have put that sort of argument forward, I think it's important for us to bear in mind that that's really not a productive way of managing our societies. Particularly if we look around the world today and we look at the various debates and arguments around the implementation of Sharia, and we've seen examples of that in many different countries, from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Sudan, and so on and so forth. None of those seem to yield us with very happy experiences. So there's a lot of debate and a lot of anxiety, and I think where, for example, the case of Egypt shows us that the Muslim world is heading is actually that people want genuine freedom where they're allowed to express their religious sentiments, but their religious sentiments as part of a whole set of human aspirations and values and likes and dislikes and so on. Religion is important to Muslims, as it is to many other people, but it is not the only paradigm and the dominating paradigm through which people see their lives. And religion sits very, very calmly and in a very comfortable way alongside a whole range of other things that people have in their lives that are also important. Religion colours the way that we look at our lives, but it's not the only prism through which we view our lives.
Do you think then that sort of political Islam, the concept of an Islamic state, it's slightly off topic in terms of the role of religion in society, but do you feel then that has failed, that concept of Islam being a political entity?
Well, Olivier Roy wrote a book a few years ago called The Failure of Political Islam, and in some ways I suppose what's happening now is an implication of his argument, in that what we're seeing in the Muslim world is not really a call for governance in the name of Islam. What we're seeing is essentially more of a Western ideal that people want free societies. Now, I know Myriam probably disagrees with me. There is a flip side to that argument, and you could argue that the presence and the sustenance and the engagement of Muslim movements throughout the whole of the last century, in a way, shows their success. I would say they failed, purely because if you look at a movement like the Muslim Brotherhood, it's been around for nearly 100 years, and in its very birthplace, Egypt, it is only 20%, 25%, 30% of that society. That to me shows that people like religion, they like some aspects of religion, but they don't want to be dictated to and dominated by religion.
That's Myriam.
Yeah, okay. Well, the failure of political Islam. The real issue here is that Islamic political movements have to be situated in their proper context, by which I mean that throughout Islamic history, and I don't mean just modern history, there have been movements of what we call Tajdid wa Islah, which is renewal and reform, which are, what we might call movements which seek to return to the basic precepts of the faith in order to create societal renewal. Now, we have seen that happen throughout various points in history, but of course, one point at which it did occur was when the challenge of colonialism was upon Muslim majority countries. And what you have during those periods is the intersection of Tajdid wa Islah, so this movement for spiritual reform, this movement for a return to the sources in order to reinvigorate what is considered to be the ethical paradigm which can allow society to reach its greatest heights, intersecting with a struggle for national independence. And so what happens is that these movements for national independence become the primary focus of this movement for reform. So while the movement for reform historically had encompassed all areas of life, and they tended to reflect the importance that Islam attributes to every different sphere, personal, social, political. And might I add that, of course, the Quran is not a political book. It's worth pointing out that less than 6% of the Quranic verses actually refer to issues of law. But that isn't to deny that there are passages that do refer to the political sphere. So without giving you an extended history lesson, the point I'm trying to make is that when you have this intersection of the national independence struggle with a movement for renewal and reform, political issues become the primary objective of these movements. And that's when you have the emergence of social movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, like others throughout the Muslim world, which have as their objective the creation of an Islamic state which would allow the renewal to occur. Now, of course, why the Islamic state? Because they're under colonial rule. So the objective is, once we get our free state, then this reform and renewal can occur in and of itself. But if you look at the core message of people like Hassan al-Banna being the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not a political message. It's a message of personal purification, of spiritual renewal, through which society can return to the position of greatness it had.
Thank you very much. I've got a hand up, so if I can take that, please.
So, this is to Mr. Dilwar Hussein. In your statement, you assume that any political Islam has a particular essence, means a particular thing. Now, what everybody will agree is that what societies need is good laws, or what you refer to as procedural secularism, that everybody gets his due share and so forth. So now, within the political Islamic movement, there is a whole variety of people, thought.
Absolutely.
And it would be, I think, not very good to assume that just a model in Saudi Arabia or in Iran, or what is, for that matter, even in Iran, you have got people like Khatami who disagree from others.
So make it succinct.
Yeah, so my point is that there is a whole heterogeneity within political Islam.
Absolutely there is. Absolutely there is. I mean, but if you see that, the Khilafah ended in 1928, 24, and these movements have been around. The Muslim Brotherhood has been around since 1928, and they haven't achieved what they set out to achieve. On that ground, I would say, well, I mean, you say the stated objective was the Islamic State.
No, that's
and
not the
achieved
original
that.
objective of Hassan
So-
al-Banna. That's not his stated objective.
So I would say on that basis that they failed. Of course, there is, I mean, I come from a background that has roots in political Islam, so I'm talking very much in a way as an insider. I understand the complexities. I understand that there are many, many different nuances. And I don't like this word Islamist, which many people use nowadays, because what it tries to do is it tries to collapse everybody into one box. You have a whole breadth of opinion from people like Erdogan in Turkey, all the way over to, the Bin Ladens and so on, the sort of the fanatics, I would say. You know, you have a very, very wide breadth of opinion that this one word tries to encapsulate. It just can't do that. It can't do that justice.
I'm afraid we're going to have to. Hold
I
that
need to
thought.
come back on one thing. I cannot possibly allow the
What
discussion
can I
to
do
continue
to-
without clarifying this. The point Dilwar made about the Western ideal taking sort of the front in the Muslim world. Hold on one second. Certain ideals are universal. They are not the monopoly of the West or any ideology. They belong to all of us. They include democracy, whether you want to call it shura or democracy. They include human rights, they include certain basic freedoms, and those are not the monopoly of any Western government or any Western ideology. And to suggest that because people in the Arab world are couching their language in the only language, actually the only idiom which is audible to the Western audience, because might I say when we start talking about shura, most people's ears shut off, is to assume that their project is fundamentally Western is erroneous. It's completely...
I didn't say that actually. I said that these notions are Western and they originated... No, I agree with you that they're universal. I've written about that.
Yeah.
But they originate in the West. You can't deny that. You can't deny the movements around freedom, around human rights, around democracy.
The Quran contains innumerable verses.
It's good, we've got into some discussion and debate, which is what this is all about. Hold that thought, we'll have to come back to it at the end. We need to move on to our next topic. But it's good to see that everyone's warmed up now. Because we've got something that's definitely going to be a talking point, jihad. The headlines, like I say, have say it enough, so I don't need to be sensationalist. But I think it's probably good to start with a simple, what is jihad? Ms. Francois.
I'm going to start by quoting Kanye West, who says that we are battling against racism, we're battling against society, we're battling against terrorism, but most of all we're battling against ourselves. And that's kind of what jihad is. So there's jihad in the sense of a struggle against your inner, darkest thoughts and potential actions, and that's the jihad of the self, the jihad al-nafs, if you like, which is, if you like, a response to a belief in the fundamental nature of humankind as being created with a tension between good and bad. We have the tendency, we have the possibility within ourselves to either what I tell my children, what I call with my children, watering the good so that it might grow, or watering the evil so that it might grow. And we do that through certain actions and through certain forms of self-restraint and self-control. The jihad, of course, the other jihad, which is the one that has more widespread understanding, is kind of, I mean, the reason I quoted Kanye on that point is because it's about injustice, right? So the jihad that is permissible, which has, I mean, it has parallels with the concept of just war theory from the Christian perspective, which is the idea that we are fundamentally looking for peace and stability on this earth. But when somebody comes and creates discord, somebody creates corruption, somebody infringes the rights of others, you do not have the right to stand by and allow that corruption and injustice to go on. You have a responsibility to ensure that those rights are guaranteed for all citizens, be they Palestinians or Burmese. So that's essentially what I would define jihad as.
Mr. Ahmed, you've been quiet.
Hard to be.
Why do you think the term jihad has been conflated and confused with terrorism?
Yeah, fine. I think to start off with, I think Myriam's on point there. It's probably useful for me just to start off by saying that I'll be speaking in a personal capacity as opposed to as a representative for the organisation. And the root word of jihad is jahada, which means making an effort, okay? Exerting oneself in order to promote good or to resist wrongdoing, evil, or oppression. And it refers to an intellectual and spiritual resistance. So really, Myriam's on point there. And it's useful just for me to point to this, actually, just before I answer properly the question as well, is it's really something that is hard to talk about, really, just in a question time panel in just a few moments, actually, because I was looking upon the works of a scholar, Jalaluddin Asyuti, the 15th century Islamic scholar, and he highlighted 80 different dimensions and uses and objectives in relation to jihad in Islamic teaching. So it's important for us just to realise how nuanced this debate nuanced this term is. I think, Sufyan, we're living in an age of fear. Following 9/11 and then 7/7, I think we're living in an age of fear where there's been a lot of politicisation of our national security, and that's what the ex-head of the MI5 actually said. Her name is Stella Rimington. She said there's been a politicisation of national security where fear is being used to forward political aims, as opposed to it being something left to security types and those experts there.
But
Part of that debate, if I was just to finish this point, is to say that you get all sorts of terms thrown into the mix, from Islamist to Jihad to all these other terms to forward that agenda of fear.
That's all fair and well, but there are individuals who've become estranged from society and are saying that this is my jihad against British society, against the non-believers, and they're using religion against it. It's happening.
You're talking about estranged from society here, and this is why we have to be very serious when we're talking about the issue of extremism in Britain and around the world. Because if you actually look deeply into the issue of terrorism, you look at what the security experts are saying, and you look at what the research shows as well. And you're talking about, let's talk about one of the 7/7 bombers. This was a guy that was working in a school, a segregated guy? I don't think so. He's working with children, very, very part integrated in society. As part of this complex of fear, religion and Islam and Islam and terrorism has got thrown into the debate, whereas the real issue and the real cause of terrorism is far more political. Actually, if you look at the motives of what a lot of these terrorists are talking about, firstly, it's a deeply complex thing. We can't just say that A plus B plus C plus D equals terrorist. I reckon that we got maybe A and B, but C, D, E, F, we just don't know. And this is what security experts themselves are saying. The MI5 themselves in 2008 said, they said there's no single pathway to terrorism.
Take this point, I'm going to take Ali, but please do contribute. I need to see hands up, and that's what this is what it's all about. But Ali, go for it.
I'd just like to know what the opinion of the panel in terms of legitimate Islamic armed resistance. I mean, surely, as Muslims, we should deplore, killing the civilians. But what is legitimate in Islam in terms of jihad? I mean, is it permissible for a British Muslim, for instance, go to Afghanistan and fight, the troops, the British troops, American troops against their brothers and sisters in Afghanistan? Likewise in Iraq, or go to Israel and do a legitimate armed resistance.
In case people at the back didn't hear, the question was, what is legitimate jihad for say, a British Muslim? So the example was given that, is it legitimate for a British Muslim to go to Afghanistan on the grounds that there are troops there and specifically, to defend the country against troops?
Can we just stick to the Quran for 1 minute in responding to that? Yeah. So there's two things we need to point out. The first is that the Quran is unequivocal when it comes to taking innocent lives. Yeah. Most of you will be familiar with the verse. If you take one life, it's like you taking the life of the whole of mankind. Yeah. And to save one life is like saving the whole of mankind. So on these issues, it's unequivocal. On top of that, some of you will know that there are around 500 hadith which have the status of the Quran. And one of those says, again, unequivocally, God forbade the killing of women and children. So on these issues, we need to be crystal clear. You mentioned the issue of resistance. It's really important that we stick to that concept when it comes to jihad, because actually jihad is all about resisting injustice. That's the only time where it becomes permissible to engage in jihad, which is something disliked. I mean, God even talks about it in the Quran as something that you may not want, but sometimes you will have to do something you dislike because it serves a purpose.
So in the examples I gave, is it
well, in the examples you gave, I would say this. There's a hadith by the Prophet, peace be upon him, that says, help your brother whether he is the oppressor or the oppressed. And then he was asked, well, what do you mean? He says, if he is the oppressor, if he is oppressed, help him. If he's the oppressor, stop him oppressing people. Yeah? In the case of Afghanistan, the question I would ask you to contemplate is whether you think that the actions of the Taliban reflect Islamic values or whether there would be an argument for saying that they're in a position where they are oppressing people and where we would be helping them by not letting them continue to oppress their own people. That's the only argument I would put.
Mr. Hussein?
Yeah, well, let me go back. I'll come to this point. It's a very important one. But let me go back. First of all, I'd be boring and agree with my fellow panelists in that I completely concur with what they've already said about jihad. Jihad actually is a very beautiful term. It's a great injustice to the terminology of Islam and to such a noble concept of Islam that it is mistreated in this way by Muslims as well as non-Muslims. It simply means to strive hard, to work hard, to do your best at something, to put your effort and your energy and your all into something. And as Myriam has said, often and usually that is an immediate, self-based, personal, spiritual thing that you're struggling against. But it is a very comprehensive term, and it goes right from the spiritual and the personal all the way over to the collective and the social and the political. So there is no surprise then that one component of jihad is physical exertion on the battlefield. That's not its normal practice, however. I mean, when the Quran talks about jihad, the Quran mentions jihad in a number of different cases. It talks about exerting your effort. It talks about striving and doing something for the people around you and for yourself. So that's the context, first of all. Secondly, in terms of your point around fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on against British troops, and that was your question.
Many foreign troops.
Going from here as a British citizen. Now there's a very clear verse of the Quran here, and there is a very clear fatwa here from 2011 by a Leeds-based scholar, Sheikh Abdullah Juday, who says that for a British citizen to go to Afghanistan, because he was asked about this particular case, to go to Afghanistan when that person, he or she, may put themselves in a conflict situation with British troops is not allowed. Because you are a citizen of this country. In the view of Islam, you have a social contract with the state. Right? You are under a contract with the state. And the verse of the Quran, and it's, I thought this may come up, so I noted it. It's Surah Al-Anfal, verse number 72. If they seek your help in the deen, then you must accept. Then you must help, except against the people with whom you have a treaty. So your covenant of citizenship works as a treaty in the eyes of Islam. When you put yourself in a position where you are actually, there are two rights being stretched here. One is the right of the Ummah to call upon your help. Okay, your fellow Muslims calling upon your help. Then there is the right of your contract. One is a legal right. One is an emotional and spiritual right. And when these two rights collide, the legal right trumps the emotional. And we can see this even in the case of the Prophet ﷺ, when he's in Hudaybiyah, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and they've just signed the treaty. And they've signed a very unequal treaty, but they've signed it nonetheless. And the argument is in the text of the treaty that if somebody from the Quraysh accepts Islam and they come to Medina, they have to be returned. And if the opposite happens, the Quraysh can keep them. And right at that moment, when the treaty is being signed, somebody comes and the Prophet, there is an argument and people say, we must accept this person. The Prophet says no, because we have this is our contract. We Muslims abide by what we agree. We are honest people. And unfortunately, this honesty, this integrity is missing from a lot of our discourse at the moment.
But, can I just add one small thing, which is that, I think a lot of young men have a somewhat idealized version of what going and fighting jihad in Iraq or Afghanistan means. So what are you going to do? Jump on a plane and turn up and be like, yo, where's the battle at? Seriously, how is that going to happen? Seriously. However, what I would say is that you have a moral responsibility to make sure that justice is served through the means available to you in this country. And there are means available to you in this country to make sure that your voice is heard against these unjust wars and occupations. And that's a responsibility you bear.
I'm going to ask if you can hold that thought, and I'm going to bring in Nabil here. So we've got this distinction between jihad and terrorism now. But we've established that there is a problem, however overrepresented it may be in society, of extremism. What do you think is the role of A, the Muslim community, and B, the government preventing terrorism extremism happening in Britain?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to start off with, is to really just agree with what Myriam just said now as well. In regard to, whilst we don't necessarily need to go over there, and I think that's always something I'm deeply comfortable with as well, which Sheikh Abdullah, is that we have a role here to play in this country, especially as students, as voicing out to say that, look, these wars aren't just, my personal views, we shouldn't be there abroad. And there's a lot we can do here from this country to ensure that oppression doesn't happen abroad to our brothers and sisters there. That's on one level. The other level is to remember them in our prayers and to pray for peace around the world. In regard to the question that you put now, in regard to what is the role of the Muslim community, what is the role of the government in relation to the issue of terrorism, I think when our starting point is properly understanding how does terrorism come about, what is it that eventually leads to somebody putting on that belt or whatever else it is that they put on. You look to what the security experts are saying as opposed to anything that we can figure out. You know that there's certain things that all these terrorists kind of go through, and this is what security experts will say. And it's not to say that they become deeply religious or anything like that, but there are certain commonalities. For example, a lot of them, they come up on their videos and say, look, this is happening to my brothers and sisters abroad, I'm doing it for them, etc., blah, blah, blah. So there you've got an unjust foreign policy that needs to be spoken against, and there needs to be legitimate means for people to voice their concerns over that and do something against that. But on another level, I think, and let's look to practical examples. Let's say the Muslim community, for example, over in Bristol, just a few years ago, there was a case emerging of a young radical who was potentially going to go on to do something dangerous. The Muslim community in that city were able to spot that in consultation and in dialogue with the security services, ensure that didn't happen, and then it didn't happen in that case there as well. The government has to be really smart about the way it handles terrorism. It's very easy in this age to play to fear and to take advantage and misuse terrorism in the way that Stella Rimington described in terms of the politicisation of terrorism. Rather, what needs to happen is there needs to be a proper kind of dialogue with Muslim communities to ensure that that communities are understood, that the causes of terrorism are understood, but also that the Muslim community isn't kind of sidelined as this problematic community, because that causes more problems than good. The third thing I would say is it's really important for us to understand the scale of this terrorism issue, is that I think it is actually it is exaggerated, in the sense that I think a recent piece of research showed that I think 1 out of 286 terrorist attacks that took place in 2010 were to do with Islamic extremism.
Well, Europol figures, which is a European policing agency, suggest that terrorism, which is conducted by Islamic extremists, represents less than 1% of terrorist attacks in Europe. So let's get things into perspective a little bit on that issue. Sorry.
I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. We could, I mean, there's a multifaceted topic, so we could talk about this for a very long time, and hopefully we can come back to that again in the 15 minutes, which is increasingly seeming too small. Our next topic, and I think it's probably wise to do ladies first with this one. How far do you think Islam is a patriarchal religion?
I think the way that Islam is practiced is deeply patriarchal, and I think we have some serious issues to do with female voices being heard in the interpretation of text, in the elucidation of its meaning, and in teaching in the community. There's a serious disconnect, if I might add, between what was the historical model in which there were female scholars teaching scores of people, men, women, they taught all of them. Nowadays, as a female speaker on the circuit, I can say that the topic I'm usually invited to speak on is women in Islam, and rarely little else. And in fact, when I do give that topic, it tends to be the brother saying, oh, well, we're not coming to that one because it's women in Islam. Right, so that doesn't concern you. Obviously not. And that sort of betrays the kind of fundamental problem I think that we have in the community, is that a lot of men don't seem to think that women's issues are their problem, and I would argue that they are the problem. And therefore their voices and that dialogue and communication is absolutely essential. The question that you asked though was, is Islam itself patriarchal? I think there is a big debate on this issue. I could give you two answers. The one is people like Asma Barlas who say you can unread the patriarchal readings of the Quran and make it a fully egalitarian text. On the other hand, I've spoken to a scholar from here in Cambridge whom I respect very much, who's saying to me, well actually, Islam is patriarchy with responsibility, which is for him the concept that patriarchy doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. There aren't really that many alternatives. There's like patriarchy, matriarchy. There ain't no neutral system, people.
So we can't have equality then in the Islamic model?
Well, that assumes that under a patriarchal model that you can't have responsible patriarchy, which is patriarchy in which men may have a stronger public role, but they facilitate the possibility of women participating. The problem I see with that, of course, is having to leave this up to men's whims, which deeply distresses me. And I don't have that much confidence in their ability to be able to do that. So I'm more inclined to say that it's possible to unread the patriarchal readings of the Quran, but that would require many more women coming up and taking the lead.
Mr. Hussein?
Yeah, I think Myriam should be very worried. I think part of the problem is, and I think Myriam's alluded to this, that part of the problem is in the way that this whole subject, not here, but generally speaking, is framed. It's always about women in Islam, and I think and there has been this obsession of the last 10 or 15 years, I think, of this spate of lecture after lecture on this one very subject. And I think, we have to start talking about the relationship between men and women. Gender relations. That's, I think, a much better way of talking about this issue. And then men would feel more included and involved in that conversation. It would highlight to them the importance and role that they play. I think the vision of the Quran is actually one of remarkable complementarity, given that what you're dealing with is a 1400-year-old text. It talks about men and women being partners. And if you look at the Prophet's life, the Prophet, peace be upon him, his life, his teachings, his examples, again, he created a social revolution around the rights of women and the roles of women. Now,
I mean,
just to finish off my point, I mean, a lot of this is about how you read Islam and how you read the texts of Islam and how you look at the life of the Prophet. And people come at this from very, very different angles. My personal view is that we have to look at the Prophet initiating social movements in a number of different areas. Tribalism, the emancipation of slaves, and the equalization of gender relations, and so on. Now, it's not necessary that in his lifetime he actually achieves what he's setting out to achieve. Tribalism is still there, even though he preaches against it very, very clearly. It's still there, even at the time that he dies. Slavery is still there, it's on its way out. Islam doesn't categorically prohibit slavery, but you can actually see where that body of teachings are going. And likewise, with gender relations, what Islam does is completely revolutionize the role of women. It limits polygamy. It doesn't actually create polygamy, it limits polygamy. It gives women inheritance rights where they had nothing. It brings them into a position where they have agency, where they were treated as property, and so on and so forth.
in fact, on that very point, so a very well expressed point, but I think from that, you seem to be saying that, well, Islam has a base and a foundation, but then it needs reformation and change to then make it properly relevant to
I wouldn't put it in that way.
Sorry, just to quote the Quran itself, I mean, women are entitled to half the inheritance of men, and there's polygamy, etc.
Could we be specific in that verse, please? It's really important that you're specific in that verse. Are women, entitled to inheritance? Why?
Can I just finish
Yeah,
also
let's
touch on- and
be
maybe we
clear,
come back,
because
but
otherwise...
Can I finish the point I was
Yes.
making? You know, so, and then the rest of my answer is, this is what Islam does is it creates a social movement, okay? But I totally accept that to look at where these teachings are heading and where these teachings are ending up, we do need a critical eye when we look at the verses and the texts and so on. And there are a few problematic issues. You have the issue of daraja, of the level, okay? The verse of the Quran says that the man is a level above the woman,
No,
but then it gives her a condition. It gives her a condition, okay, on the basis of what is spent, on the basis of economics. There is the verses around polygamy. Again, the verse on polygamy come in the context of orphans and the destitute and the needy. There is the verses on the beating, okay. And then there is the issue of inheritance. All of this, I think, for us require a critical analysis of the text, which says, this is what Islam was trying to achieve. This is where we are as a society. And these things don't necessarily match up if you take things literally and if you take things word for word.
Okay.
And that then does need a process of reform. And it does need scholars to go to the text and say, what is the intention of Islam here? And how does that intention manifest itself in our society today?
Myriam.
Yeah, well, speaking of intention, yeah, I mean, the maqasid, which is the objective behind any given law, is absolutely essential in understanding why any particular law was given in the Quran. But we need to also be clear in the language that we use. When the Quran says that the man has daraja alayha, which is the degree, it doesn't say degree above her. Actually, alayha means like towards her. And the understanding that Ibn Abbas, who was a companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and who was said to have tawakkul, like a particularly good insight into Quranic understanding, his understanding of daraja alayha was that it meant that men have a degree of responsibility towards women that women don't have towards them. And that responsibility was that and this was in another saying of the Prophet, that the men have to give women all of their rights, but they should never request all of their rights from them. And that's how Ibn Abbas understood that verse. So we need to be really clear when we speak of this stuff. Inheritance. I mean, the fact is, the only reason that women were given less inheritance, and it doesn't always work out as half, actually, it depends who you are in the family structure, whether you get half, was because men had a responsibility to provide for women financially in all spheres. Food, housing, clothing is a male responsibility in a tribal society in which, guess what, there is no welfare state. So that becomes incumbent upon the men of that society. Had you given men and women equal inheritance, I think it's fairly obvious to see that would have penalised the men in that society who had the additional responsibility of caring for the women in that time. So the objective behind that law is what? For men and women to have the same amount. However, had it been the same amount, it would have actually penalised one against the other. So we need to understand the objective behind the law at any given point in time. The verse that's referred to as the beating, I mean, I could talk about this stuff all night, shall we? The Daraba verse, the famous beat her lightly, which of course is fine, right? Because it won't leave a mark. No, I don't buy that at all. I think what we have to look at is the way that this was understood by different scholars, and the fact is there is huge diversity of interpretation on this particular verse. Now, when there is a verse that is not well understood in the Quran, we are instructed on how to proceed in interpreting that verse. And guess what? The instruction is, look at the way the Prophet, peace be upon him, conducted himself on this issue. So, we have a verse which is unclear, we look at the life of the Prophet. Did the Prophet, peace be upon him, ever strike his wives? No, he did not. Did he show disgust and deep condemnation for people who did? Absolutely. So, when we want to understand that verse, we look at the behaviour, and the behaviour says this is unequivocally wrong and unacceptable.
Any contributions?
If I was just to come on top of that, just to say, agreeing with everything that Myriam has talked about and looked at the example of the Prophet ﷺ, and what closer example than to talk about, let's say, two of his wives, one of them, Khadija, who is extremely involved and contributing to her society, and another wife of his, Aisha radiallahu anha, went on to become a famous and important scholar in Islam. And then you look upon the generations after the Prophet, peace be upon him. And when we're talking about religious leadership, we had thousands of scholars who were female. And this is something that many Muslims really just don't get today. And the thing I want to kind of present as original just out here is just kind of a very modern day present context. Is there's a really amazing scholar who's based over in Oxford, Sheikh Akram Nadwi, I think, who is over here today in Cambridge, who's done some phenomenal work, volumes and volumes of it dedicated to the works of female scholars. The thing is, we need to regain female religious leadership in our society, but there's two things, there's kind of two shackles that need to be broken. First is cultural mispractice and misunderstanding. A lot of this, I think, has unfortunately come as a result of culture. It's been imported from all over the Muslim majority countries abroad, including the Indo-Pak countries. And that really needs to be broken free of, because I think there's some serious mispractice going on there. And then secondly, I think, and I see this actually, I think men have to maybe let go a little bit actually as well. And I'm involved in, Muslim... I have to represent a little bit, diplomatic. And I think that's true, but I think that applies to men as a whole. The good news, guys, I would say as well, in being involved on the ground is, and even here at Cambridge, is that you had a female Islamic Society president. Now that's just one thing to mention, but increasingly you're seeing this generation who's becoming more and more informed about their religion, understanding the value of female religious leadership in society, and that's why I'm very happy when my sister or my wife or my sister's friends and they're leading projects and they're doing dynamic work. Even here in Cambridge, actually, you have a sister who's one of the lead national student representatives in the National Union of Students, wearing a hijab, contributing to society dynamically, and that's really positive. So there is good news on the way.
We have a question from the floor here.
Ultimately, you keep on talking about not looking at how Muslims practice religion, but religion itself inherently, its rules about its attitude towards women, etc. But surely, we can't completely separate the two. I mean, if Islam sees women in such a light, and we discussed it in so much depth, why is it so easy for men all over the world to misunderstand their religion so easily? Isn't it inherently skewed if it's so easily misunderstood and there's no reflection of this attitude towards women?
I don't think that, and obviously I'll be accused of being a man-hater here, but men need much of an excuse to be able to look at text in their favour, particularly when they're in a society in which women don't have access to means of power in order to be able to change those structures. Fundamentally, the question is whether the people that you're talking about are acting as Muslims or are they acting as men. The main issue that I see is that in a lot of so-called Muslim countries, which are actually, in many cases, we're talking about Arab countries or Pakistan, I think that to call people there Muslim is to do a disservice to the structuring of their own identity. The degree to which they place an importance on spiritual guidance in how they manage their lives is sublimely overestimated. If you think that most citizens in most Muslim majority countries lead their lives thinking whether their behaviour is in line with the ethical ideals of Islam, I think, we need a reality check.
So saying men are, largely not following Islam well, and
I think this is a very important question. And it's a quick answer to it. I think we're broadly in agreement. We may slightly differ in terms of the methodology through which we're reaching. I think we're all in agreement that the stuff we mentioned around beating and polygamy and this and that and the daraja, I think where we differ is how we get to those arguments and how we get to the conclusion. And here's a defense of why I think a purely traditionalist approach to that isn't going to work. I think we do need reform because of exactly your question. And we also have to bear in mind that there are in the books of hadith, so-called hadith, which if looked at critically, and scholars like Abdullah Jadai are doing this and looking at hadith very critically, and there are others, people in Turkey and so on, hadith which are very condescending and very demeaning. And they have been recorded down in the books as though they are authentic hadith attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. From, talking about women not having intellect, talking about women being in hell, talking about women being a distraction, and so on and so on and so forth. So, let me finish, please. So these
twisting of the words.
No, you can describe it however you want, but these hadith are there. The scholars are coming to this text. Scholars are coming to there are even worse ones about dogs and so on and so forth. Believe me, these hadith are there. Scholars are coming to the text and saying, actually, look, if we look at this properly, if we look at the sanad, if we look at the matan properly, these are not authentic. And there is a whole body of evidence, so-called evidence, that has been built up. Not only this, but on a number of other issues, political issues, for example, because of the climate of the time, because it was convenient for people to throw these sorts of things into the mix. And now, and this is why people like Asma Parlas and Amina Wudu, their scholarship is important, because now, after having a century of feminism here in the West, we have a whole new approach to looking at gender relations. Don't forget that it's only in the last century that women in the West got the vote. Only up until 1970 that women in Switzerland got the vote. There's been a sea change in the way that humanity thinks about these issues. And now we can go back and look at the sources and actually say, well, look, given who we are today as human beings, we can actually reread some of this text. And that's why that process of reform with a small r is very important. Simply relying on the evidences and simply saying that distinguishing between Islam and people and so on, it's not enough, because there is more to this than meets the eye.
Take one last question.
So you talked about the same understanding of rereading there, because initially you said it could be patriarchal with responsibility and looking at in its truest form, but then you said also rereading, the possibility of rereading. So were you talking about the same form of rereading? I mean, what do you mean by that?
He was referring to the same person I was referring when he said that Asma Balas is one of the people like Amina Wudu who are rereading the Quran and trying to, if you like, extract what they consider to be gender bias. So what you have actually within this debate is two main sides. One is what you've called traditionalists, which is saying that actually there are certain immutables in the text that if you draw them out are equalizing and you don't need to reform the text. The other side would say actually the text itself needs to be reformed and reviewed.
No.
But I think, well, Amina Wudu says parts of the Quran should be set aside. She believes certain parts of the Quran shouldn't be, she doesn't believe in certain parts of the Quran, which from a Muslim perspective, in which obviously the Quran is considered to be the revealed word of God, is obviously
I don't think she argues that. I think she talks
she
about how
does.
to it. She talks about...
She rejects certain parts of the Quran.
She doesn't reject that this is the word of God, but she may say that this is not applicable.
No, she says she does not
There's a big
accept
difference
this part of the Quran.
No, I don't think she says that.
Oh, okay.
I think that's a good point to move on.
Yeah.
So, moving on from our topic, which I should have not called women in Islam, called gender relations or something. We're looking at citizenship and big society. But actually, just a point of clarification from before, we were talking about the Quran and the Hadith. If people don't know what the Hadith are narrations or accounts of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actions, deeds, accounts, etc. So they're not the word of God as the Quran is meant to be, but they are sort of narrations. And there's a whole science of how those are recorded and a history of those.
And it's very important to note that if they're in contradiction with the Quran, they are not accepted. So a hadith that would say, for example, that women is a dog, which I've never read, but let's say it did. The Quran saying that women are the spiritual equals of men would go against a hadith that said that women were dogs or whatever it is. And so that hadith could not be accepted.
Okay.
Any hadith that runs contrary to the Quran is not accepted.
We can have a whole seminar on how the Hadith and the Quran interrelate, but we don't have time. What we do have time for is citizenship and the big society. Mr. Cameron, who we all love very much, especially from his contribution to the Munich conference last week, or the week before perhaps, talks about his concept of big society, which is actually something that I think may be a point of commonality, and I'd like to bring in Nabil Ahmed here. I mean, what, if anything, does Islam have to contribute to the notions of big society and citizenship?
my starting point on this is not going to be Cameron's definition of what a big society is or whatever his political agenda is. Allowing me to answer the question itself would be just going back to where we started right at the start, actually, to talk about Islam and its and how it is holistic. And it's useful, I actually wanted to say this at the start, and the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, when he was approaching the city of Medina after leaving the city of Mecca, on his journey there, escaping from there. And his words on the way, stopping by a place called Quba, was to say, and think about the holistic Islamic message here, as well as contribution. He said, spread peace, feed the hungry, honour kinship ties, pray while people sleep, ye shall enter paradise in peace. As Muslims, we're called to be witnesses unto mankind, and that's in the Quran. And what that means is to not just say, even here, it is not righteousness that you turn your faces towards east or west, it's righteousness to believe in God and the last day and the age, and so on and so forth. That was in the Quranic recitation at the start. I think Muslims, really by getting our act together, and by embodying and being witnesses unto human mankind, will naturally be incredible contributors to British society. Both by changing ourselves, we will change society as well for the better. And I think this has to be our paradigm. I do think what Mr. Cameron is trying to do through his big society is and this is my personal view to say that, is basically a facade for conservative political aims to reduce the size of the state, transfer power towards private companies, and to market. Sorry. Yeah, I don't like. And that's why I think it's important not to look at it within that framework, but to look at it in terms of what can Muslims really contribute, which is something extremely positive that needs to take place from within the community. Sorry.
My laptop's in there.
You spoke ill of Cameron and now
Anything from the floor, especially the back. I think people seem to have fallen asleep. Okay, yeah.
Thank you to the panel, first of all. I think we need to remember that the definition of a Muslim is somebody who submits to the will of God. And that is very important for Muslims and non-Muslims to understand. And we all know that obviously justice is something that God wants in all things. So on the question at hand, big society, whatever we may think of Mr. Cameron, Mr. Blair, or Mr. Brown, or for that matter, even scholars, if we truly submit to the word of God, and going back to the original sources of the Quran and the pure, the correct hadith, then we wouldn't blindly follow any group, and we also wouldn't blindly oppose any group. So actually, aspects of the concept of the big society are very good in making societies more responsible and accountable, in encouraging people to participate in society. Other conservative, regardless, other conservative values are also excellent, encouraging marriage, for example. We don't have to do everything, but we need to do what is good. I would also caution the panel on questioning whether somebody's Muslim or not. That's a dangerous
no one, I don't think anybody questioned
to
anyone.
discuss. And also, on the issue of reform, going back to the concept of Muslim submitting to the will of God.
If I can just get a very succinct question.
You need to understand that it is for someone to understand the law, not to change it to become a better law now. It may be that it is being incorrectly understood, but to say it needs to be changed or reformed is dangerous.
Should we go back to the big society?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, the initials of the big society are quite telling. And it's, I mean, it's, I have very mixed feelings about this, just as I think you were hinting at. On the one hand, there is there is this idea that people should chip in, people should do more, people should volunteer, people should do things that are socially responsible and so on and so forth. But you cannot but help feel that this is coming in the context of a very strong political agenda, which is about reducing the size of the state, which is about masking the extent and the level and the depth of the cuts that are happening right now. And I think even if it was a genuine good idea, which I have my questions about, but even if it was, it's absolutely the wrong time to try to implement and to try to take forward to the nation. I mean, you know, at a time when people are going to be doing less volunteering, if you go back to, if you look at the chap who's in charge of, I think Nat Way, he's a chap who put in charge of the Big Society agenda. He announced a couple of weeks ago that he has to do now more work and less voluntary work because he can't afford it. And if he's doing that, and he's in the House of Lords, and he's a reasonably wealthy businessman, trust me, people who are on £20,000 a year and less than that are going to be doing a heck of a lot more work because of the cuts that they'd anticipated. If people have less time to volunteer, society's only going to get smaller, not bigger. And so, while it may be a good idea in principle on many levels, my fear is actually that it's not going to work.
Well, I mean, the fact is, the concept of the big society is an ideological smokescreen to hide what the government is actually doing and to point to something which everybody actually believes in. Yeah, we all believe volunteering is a good thing, but guess what? Volunteering requires you to be in a comfortable state so that you're not yourself struggling and in need of the support of a volunteering organisation. And the measures that are being taken by this government mean more and more people will actually be on the receiving end of those organisations because they will be in incredibly precarious situations. The cuts to housing in London, for example, funding for public housing, means that, you know, an increasing number of people will be finding themselves homeless or basically priced out of London. There is nothing big society about increasing the gap between rich and poor, which is what the government's policies are doing. And so my contribution, and I hope this is the Muslim contribution and the ethical contribution to the big society, is to fight against the policies that the big society is actually shielding from our view. Because the big society is here to say, look this way so you don't see what's really going on. Because what's really going on is going to have serious ramifications for the standards of living of the poorest in the society. They're going to be more destitute people, more homeless people, more people suffering economically, including some of the people who've been doing okay previously. So just don't be duped.
Any responses or thoughts from the floor? No, in which case, to take this discussion to a slightly different perspective, we see that a trend that's happened in the last sort of 20 years, and maybe more, of Muslims becoming fairly introspective, or having been introspective, perhaps that's changing. Do you think, I mean, aside from volunteering and big society and things like that, what's fueling this introspection and this sort of segregation within the Muslim community? Is it because of a lack of affiliation to, you know, being loyal, being a loyal British citizen, or is it something that's social cultural?
So the reason I'm confused by the question is because the 2001 census, which is the only recent information we have on social segregation and geographical segregation, suggests that the most segregated communities geographically are Sikhs and Jews, and that the communities that self-isolate the most are Christians and those of no faith. So, whilst we hear a lot about the segregated Muslim community, the statistics I'm just going on the facts here, don't suggest that Muslims are self-segregating. That said, if you're talking about a ghettoized mentality, we're on the same page. There is a problem with ghettoized mentality within the Muslim community, but that's partly to do with the fact that Muslims are in ghettos.
I think it's very easy to throw the label of, you know, Muslim to the ghettoisation thing, but we do have more than just Muslims who are ghettoised today in Britain. It's important to remember that Muslims, if you apply the faith label, let's say Pakistani Indian Muslim communities in this country, and Bengali community as well, haven't actually been around this country for so long, 40, 50 years. It's 69% of British Muslims of Pakistani Bengali origin live in some poverty. Unemployment rates are higher than for any other faith group. 11% of prisoners. What we have at the moment is we have issues applied to Muslims, not because anything to them being Muslim, but rather a resultant of being an immigrant community. I haven't been around in this country for so long. In recent years, we're having more British Muslim students going to university than ever before, although that may be about to change as a result of the tuition fees issues. I think we do have responsibility of, as people who have come through the community become more affluent. So initially you had basically Muslims coming into this country who were having jobs at the lower end of the spectrum, who've been able to move up the spectrum, and their kids have been able to go to university. I think there's a really important responsibility on the Muslim student types that get to go to university to not just jump into the mainstream, but whilst also doing that, be able to pay enough time for where their parents used to live 20, 30 years ago, and ensure that participation is widened so that kids realise that they have the opportunities to do the things that we've been able to do as well. I think the mentality that we have to approach it with is not just to look at it as a Muslim issue, but we do have a big responsibility to ensure that our more youthful generations are empowered to participate.
Just say something to
Yeah, I mean, your question sort of presumed that people are not involved, and not energised and are withdrawing, and I would contest that. I mean, I travel up and down this country doing sessions like this and so on and so forth, and I see people very heavily involved in their local communities. I see, hundreds, if not thousands, of Muslim organisations, local, national, people, turning out to vote, people donating to charities, people doing lots and lots of. In Leicester, where I live, we've just had a 3-month campaign feeding homeless people in the city, particularly because of the winter months and so on. These sorts of things are happening up and down the country. I do see people involved. I would question the assumption. Now, there are issues, I think, as Myriam has said, around residential segregation, and partly they're about poverty, partly they're about housing policy, partly they're about the way that migration and settlement to this country happened. The best way of challenging that residential segregation, and it is there, and at some level it is a concern, the best way of dealing with that is economic and educational empowerment. Sometimes people can self-segregate, let's be honest, because if you get into a community, you have the local mosque, you have the halal food shops, you have the sort of takeaways and restaurants that you like and so on, and for some people it can become a bit of a comfort zone. They like living in those areas, but actually, hey, it's not just Muslims who do that, it's all sorts of people. Have you ever been to Chinatown? Have you ever been to North London and the Jewish communities there? And so on and so forth. So it's a natural human tendency. People like to live within walking distance of the services that they use, whether they're mosques or churches or shops that sell speciality sort of cuisine and so on. But if we want people to mix, I mean, the question really is about, do people have the opportunity to mix? Do people have the opportunity to reach out to others? I think that's happening, and I think increasingly, particularly after 9/11, people have realised, Muslims have realised, they have to get out there, they have to reach out to people, and I see a lot of that happening.
I think that's a good place to wrap up the discussion proper. And we have only about 10 or so minutes for general question and answers. So if there are more than so if I can have 1, 2, and 3, please. Sorry, yeah. John.
Just on the issue of jihad, it was really good sort of understanding traditionalism, but then I don't feel like we gave enough justice to a sort of a deeper principle of I don't know.
So should we just I think the phone crashed, it wasn't his fault. Sorry, Johnny, if you could repeat that because I didn't catch it.
Yeah, so what about non-British Muslims? So you talked about, a contracted country, which is great, I mean, but, for a Muslim coming from a different country, I mean, my reading wouldn't be that they would therefore be the whole Muslim community of the world, other than the British would be obliged to go to Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think, could you talk a little bit more about the sort of principles that underpin such as eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but it's better than tooth for the ear. For example, there's a general principle which is very important, which sits next to justice and the idea that to help the oppressor is best to stop them, but also for 13 years in Mecca, then
Okay.
Prophet.
Yeah. If we hold that thought, I'm going to take the questions.
I'm going to take 3 in a row.
Yeah, if possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered what you thought. In the last couple of months, we've seen a lot of images from like Tunisia and Egypt, and a lot of those images seem to confound maybe kind of stereotypes of Islam, and what kind of effect do you think that's had on Western views of Islam? For example, I thought it was interesting that a lot of the Republican presidential candidates in America had nothing to say because they had no like framework within which to kind of talk about those events because they didn't conform to stereotypes. And also in the last couple of months in Britain, I think, do you think Islamophobia is increasing or decreasing? I think it's changing, but I'm not sure if it's increasing or decreasing.
And sorry, the third question. Yeah.
I was just going to refer back to the first topic, which is the public sphere. I think we've heard quite a bit about how when Islam's coming into Britain, how much society here can perhaps benefit from some of what the teachings of the Quran have, and also from this last question being society. We've also heard a few other things about, like for example, the rise of women leaders and the need to be investigated text. Is it possible to flip the question around, particularly to the gentleman on the right who's the head of FACES? When looking at not what Islam can contribute to Britain, but what our sort of coming into Britain, what Britain or British life can help with the wider Islam. As the head of a student society, does that fill you with excitement or fear, or is there something that you'd like to comment on that? Because obviously Islam that's coming into Britain is going to change a lot, and it's not just one way around.
So if we return back to the first question, which I didn't note down.
It was on Jihad, and the question was about whether the principle of the contract, which applies to UK citizens, what happens to citizens outside of the UK. I think in the cases of citizens outside the UK, but this is a general principle. I mean, you alluded to the fact that it's not about an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, and that the Quran prefers forgiveness. And this is obviously a fact, a principle within the Quranic teachings. But I think the question is more about whether the conflict you're looking at is one in which armed resistance is the best solution to alleviating the suffering of the people that you're looking at, because the objective is not armed conflict, the objective is alleviation of suffering. If armed conflict is only going to increase the bloodiness of an already devastatingly bloody conflict, then that would be considered against the very aim of jihad, which is to alleviate the suffering. In that sense, I think that the most reasonable recommendation for people is not to do anything that is likely to increase bloodlet in those situations.
What would you sort of Quranic or Hadith source be to justify? It would just be useful to reference it.
Yeah, well, the reference would be the fact that behind every Quranic justification, I mean, the objectives behind every Quranic justification are a set of 5 maqasid, or objectives behind the law, if you like. And one of them, the primary one, is the preservation of life. The first objective of all laws in the Quran is the preservation of life. And any law that goes against that becomes subservient to that principle. So the protection and preservation of life is the number one priority, and that's what I would say is the rule.
Would you like to comment on that?
Just very quickly, ditto to that, and also to say, look, I mean, Islam is, one facet of the meaning of Islam is submission, one facet is peace. It comes from a source, a root word that means peace. Salam is peace. So the vision of Islam is about a peaceful, harmonious society. There are some, sadly, minority of people within the Muslim world who have inverted that and made conflict their be-all and end-all. And as Myriam has said, our purpose has to be how do we minimize conflict and how do we maximize peace. And that has to be the way in which we, because that takes us back to the original spirit of what Islam is here to do. And anything which runs counter to that, I think, holds us back. Unfortunately, as I say, some people, they've developed this for some understandable reasons and some not so understandable reasons, because of colonialism and because of the terrible tragedies that have blighted the Muslim world for so long. But they've got themselves into a conflict mindset, and that's all they can see. But we have to break out of that, and ultimately the purpose has to be what can minimize conflict and harm and bloodshed, and what will maximize people living together harmoniously and living together in peace and in justice and safety.
Moving on to the second question, if I can bring in Nabil here. So we had the question of whether we think Islamophobia has increased or where that's at, and then also thoughts and reflections on the goings on in Egypt, Tunisia, etc., and how that's challenging conceptions.
Sure. Through the subjugation of fear at the moment, I think there's a lot of nasty things actually happening to Muslims in this country, and I would say Islamophobia is definitely on the up, especially in a way that we don't actually necessarily see all the time as well, or reported in the media, or known by the mainstream community as well, whether it be mosques being firebombed, whether it be people being attacked in the street for wearing a beard or a scarf, and so on. So Islamophobia is definitely on the up, and there has to be, firstly, a genuine realisation. I'm talking about Islamophobia here, I'm not just talking about people that look as Muslims and a fear of Islam as well, and I think that's very real. I think there needs to be a deep realisation about that as well, and there's an organisation called the European Muslim Research Centre, which I think, I didn't mean to plug that, which is doing a lot of extensive work on this, which hasn't been done before. In regard to Egypt and the people uprisings abroad, this was spoken about earlier just before. I think it's extremely exciting as well. I think nobody saw this coming. You speak to religious leaders and so forth. People didn't think that this would happen in their lifetime or maybe in the generation after, but it's happening now, and people are amazed at what's happening. I think it's deeply instilled people a lot of energy as well. Even myself as a student leader here, completely inspired by what's happening abroad. Political Islam, all this was touched upon before. Even if you look at, and I hate the term political Islam because I think Islam teaches people to be wholesome and to have lots of different spheres, because Islam is holistic in itself, and as part of that you take an interest in doing things positively politically. But let's say these political Islamic leaders, what are they asking for? They're not asking for Islamic law right now, they're asking for freedom. And that's a message that's echoed across the Arab world as well. And I'm talking about the most prominent Islamic scholars, and freedom is what they're after. I think there's a lot that we can take from there. I think as a Muslim, when you believe that anything can happen with the will of Allah, of God, you become dynamic in the sense that as a young Muslim here, you think that, you know what, we're capable of anything. We don't have to go to wars with country Iran in the future or wherever else.
Yeah, I was just on the subject of political Islam, and I know a lot of people, kind of recoil in horror when they hear the term, but obviously Islam is about giving people a set of ethics, and the idea that you should somehow leave your ethics at the door when you're involved in politics, that you should have unethical politics, unless you're Machiavelli, surely is not a good idea. So that's sort of my little point on political Islam. But on the idea of Islamophobia, I mean, as you mentioned, I've done extensive research, interviewed tens of people on this subject, and seen incidents ranging from kind of people being spat at. I almost say that like it's benign, like, yeah, people get spat at, and, name calling, ranging from the kind of sand nigger and raghead, which I've heard a couple of times myself, through to the sort of violent attacks in which people have bottles thrown at them, have been physically assaulted, and then discrimination in the workplace, that sort of thing that also happens. One particular case we looked into was just horrifying, somebody being bullied at work and having to resign over mental health issues as a consequence of her bullying in the workplace. So I, without dwelling on my own, because I don't see myself as a victim, but these things have happened to me. I have indeed been attacked myself on the tube twice. I have had my throat and that of my sand nigger children. Yeah. So, you know, and I'm one person, and these are my experiences. So.
I think we'll move on to the third question. So, directed towards Nabil, looking at how British life itself can help or contribute to Islam itself and Muslim students.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So within Islam, so within the scope of Sharia, which defined as way to the source, and you have things which are to do with worship, which are very defined, and then you have issues which relate to your, not the ritual worship, but rather the whole part of your life, which there is guidance towards, and there's certain specific things which are outlawed, but really you have guidance upon principles and ethics and so on and so forth. Within that space, there's a lot of space for culture as well, so that's why you find, you know, it's like differences and nuances between the way that Sharia law has been developed over time. I think coming over here, I'll be very specific about something which is something that we can benefit, and I think I would say, and I speak to other people who have been around in the Muslim community for a little while, to say that Britain is probably the best place to be a Muslim in the world today, and that's because the freedoms that we have. And one particular thing that I'd like to just pin down on, which really I end up speaking about quite a lot, and it's the issue of freedom of expression at British university campuses. Okay, and this is something that we can so easily take for granted, which is something that we have that even in the States they don't have like we have. So as a Muslim student, or as Muslim people, I think that we need to not take that for granted, firstly, but secondly, cherish some of these freedoms that we have, and have discussion forums like this and so forth, so that we can really properly speak about our religion, but also politically voice ourselves as much as possible as well.
Mr. Hussein?
Yeah, just some quick points on those questions. And on the Islamophobia thing, I think it's deeply worrying that the way that European and American society has become more and more tolerant of anti-Muslim sentiment and views. This is about prejudice. It's not, at the moment, of course, we're talking about Muslims, and it's Islamophobia, but it's prejudice full stop. And the way that some of these far-right movements have grown in both Europe and America is deeply, should be worrying for everybody, not just for Muslims, because, you know, these people are nasty people, and they don't like the fact that societies are so diverse. So Muslims may well be their target at the moment, but they're not going to just pack up and go home if and when Muslims were to disappear or not be the focal point of discussion. This is hate speech, and it will stay around and it will haunt Europe and America until we actually put an end to this. The point about Egypt and Tunisia and other countries, and it's sad to see what's happening in some of these countries like Bahrain, for example, now, and the terrible clampdown that is going on against the Shia, particularly in Bahrain. But what happened in Egypt was so exciting and so interesting, and in a way so inspirational. I was so proud of the Egyptian people, millions and millions of people marching on the streets with very, very few cases of violence or assault or injury or anything like that. The way that they were cleaning up the roads and effectively running that society for a matter of weeks. You know, we were told all sorts of things. Arabs can't handle democracy, they can't handle freedom, Muslims can't deal with this sort of free society. If you allow this to happen, the boogeyman will come, and so will take over, and so will do this, and it all turned out to be a load of rubbish at the end of the day. And I think it shows us what we started off with, that, you know, ideas like freedom, ideas like the aspiration to be free, these are human values. These are genuinely human, universal, global values. All people aspire to these things. And this just one sentence, what can Britain give to us? I'm really excited. Because when we have a generation of people, and 2 generations, 3 generations of people growing up here in the West, with the education that you guys are getting, okay, with the critical insights that people are being nurtured into, this is an amazing opportunity for Islam. Islam will flourish in a new way. We'll have a new self-critical Islam.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to
out of Europe.
Quickly running out of time. 2 last questions. They have to be very quick fire. If I can just have a show of hands, just to make sure we haven't got. Okay, Ali and then.
Okay. To what extent do you think that the mistreatment of Muslims in this country, like the attacks that you were talking about, are a result of propaganda, either from certain groups, certain parts of the media, or even the government? And to what extent do you think these can be toppled, or are being toppled, as a result of the images we're seeing from Egypt and Tunisia, where the propaganda seems to be falling flat?
Yeah, I want to just quickly come back to points number 1 and 2 regarding political Islam. I think it's not a fair statement to say that the Muslim Brotherhood have failed in Egypt because they have a 20 to 30% following, just because they haven't really been able to express themselves democratically and we clamp down on. And political Islam is very popular among Muslims, even in the Arab world, for instance, Sudan and Algerian elections in the 90s. My second quick question is regarding Jihad. I think, yeah, sure, Jihad has different forms, but I think we should make a distinction of what's legitimate and what isn't legitimate. We shouldn't shy away from what is legitimate Jihad.
So what's the actual question?
I think my question is, he said a British Muslim going to Afghanistan shouldn't be fighting because of this dilemma of citizenship. Does that mean you're agreeing with a British Muslim going to Afghanistan to fight against an American troop? I mean, what is legitimate and what isn't legitimate?
Okay, going back to the first one, exactly the attacks as well, propaganda, how that's been drawn up by Egypt.
Well, I think there have been several very good studies actually looking at the role that the media play in exacerbating, if not fostering, I guess, ambiance of kind of Muslim bashing. I think you can look at things like the Cardiff study of journalism in 2001, which found that a preponderance of negative images of Muslims being used in the media. Other studies have shown that in the case of Muslims, let's not let the facts get in the way of a good story, and that there are a great many stories that are published that are have no basis in reality or are based on a very kind of random story. I remember the story of cabbie doesn't allow blind dog into his cab, and it was like the front page of the Daily Mail, and it was like some guy in Arizona. The front page of the Daily Mail carrying a story about a dude in Arizona. It doesn't even happen. It didn't even happen in our country. Anyway, my point was I don't actually think that what's happening in Egypt and Tunisia is having a huge impact on the way that people perceive Muslims at all, actually. I think that a lot of the media surrounding it is not very well informed, and people have a limited amount of interest in what's going on in the Arab world generally.
Moving on to the second second question, because we're literally out of time. So there was a specific question about Jihad.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of points there about Jihad. Yeah, I mean, there will always be, sadly, in life, legitimate cases where you have to take to arms. And the Quran talks about this. We don't have a lot of time to go into it. The Quran talks about it. It talks about, in quite a lot of detail, because this is a fairly sensitive issue. It talks about what you should do, when you should stop, when you should refrain, when you should turn back, and so on and so forth. And yes, if you are physically under attack, of course, under any human sensibilities, you have a right to defend yourself, your property, the lives of those around you, your nation, and so on. So if the French attacked us, yes, that would be a jihad. For us to defend ourselves, it would be a jihad. Now, the point you made about whether you can go to Afghanistan and so on and fight against, I think that's far, far more complicated. And I wouldn't even want to get into that sort of situation, because first of all, you're dealing with allied forces. You're dealing with a very complex global international set of treaties, arrangements, and so on and so forth. I think it's best just to avoid that. We are here, we are citizens of this country. There's a lot we can do here, as Myriam mentioned earlier, to push our governments for justice. Ultimately, this is not about who's your allegiance to, whether it's Muslims or the Ummah or Britain or ultimately it's all Muslims. Their allegiance is to truth. Their allegiance is to justice. The Quran is very clear about that. If a Muslim is wrong, we are against that Muslim. If a non-Muslim is right, we are with that non-Muslim. It's not about Islam or not Islam. It's not about this country or that country. If my country is wrong, we need to stop. We need to, do whatever we can to stop the policies of our country.
And I think
so when our country goes to war, we have to try and stop that.
Thank you very much. I think it would be apt if you could all join me in thanking. Stay in your seats for a second, just a couple of quick announcements. Firstly, thank you very much for attending. Secondly, you'll find by your seats feedback forms. It would be really appreciated if you could fill these in so that we can figure out what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And please be as critical as possible. You can also, there's a tick box there if you're interested in further events to learn about Islam. Please do tick that in. Sorry, a couple of quick things. The evening of spirituality that was scheduled for tomorrow has now been rescheduled for Sunday, March the 13th in the Lucia Windsor room. And lastly, there will be some refreshments that we'll bring in here. So please do stick around for a chat. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask ISoc members or indeed the panel. Thank you very much for being a great audience. Have a lovely evening. Take care how you get home. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you.